Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, to let the day finally settle behind you. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom somewhere? A cozy corner where the evening has finally grown still? Tonight we're going to explore Renaissance Florence, a city that changed the course of human history not through conquest or war, but through beauty. We'll discover how a small Italian city-state became the birthplace of a cultural revolution, understand why artists and thinkers gathered there in unprecedented numbers, and contemplate what it meant when humanity decided to create art that celebrated not just the divine, but the human capacity for beauty itself. It's a journey that spans roughly 200 years, from the early 1400s to the height of the 1600s, and touches the lives of some of history's most brilliant minds. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a frantic tour through museums or a rushed catalogue of paintings and sculptures. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the streets of this remarkable city, taking our time with each artist, each innovation, each quiet revolution in how people saw themselves and their world. By the end, I think you'll find that the Renaissance wasn't just about art at all, but about what happens when humans dare to see themselves as creators. If you enjoy these calm explorations, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for making this community what it is. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath. And let's begin our slow drift through Renaissance Florence, a city where marble came to life and paint captured the soul. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the story of this extraordinary place unfold around you. Let's begin with the place itself, the physical reality of Florence before any paint-touched canvas or chisel-struck marble. Florence sits in a valley in Tuscany, cradled between hills, with the Arno River flowing through its heart like a vein carrying life. In the early 1400s, when our story truly begins, it was a city of perhaps 50,000 souls, which made it substantial, but not enormous by European standards. The city had grown wealthy, remarkably so. But not from conquest or vast territories. Florence's wealth came from something more subtle, more modern perhaps: banking, trade, and the skilled transformation of raw materials into luxury goods. The landscape shaped everything. The Tuscan hills provided stone, the kind that takes a chisel well and holds fine detail for centuries. The river provided power for mills and a route for commerce. The wool trade had made many families rich, taking raw fleece and transforming it through elaborate processes into cloth so fine that royalty across Europe wanted it. And where there is wealth concentrated in a relatively small space, something interesting begins to happen. People have time to think. They have resources to spend on things beyond mere survival. The city itself was a network of narrow streets, tall buildings pressed close together, creating shadows and intimacy. Churches rose above the rooflines, their bells marking time for everyone who lived there. Workshops filled the ground floors where artisans worked at trades passed down through generations. The smell would have been intense, a mixture of wool processing, leather tanning, cooking, animals, and the particular scent of a medieval city where thousands of people lived in close quarters. But walk along the Arno at evening, when the light turned golden on the hills, and you might understand why people who lived there thought their city was blessed, chosen somehow for something special. This was a republic, technically, governed by guilds and councils rather than a single ruler, though powerful families wielded enormous influence. The Medici family had not yet achieved their dominance in the early 1400s, but they were rising, building their banking empire transaction by transaction. The political structure meant that merchants and artisans had a voice, that wealth could buy influence even without noble blood. This mattered more than you might think. In a world where birth determined destiny for most people, Florence offered a crack in that wall, a suggestion that talent and effort might matter as much as ancestry. And perhaps most importantly, Florence in the early 1500s sat at a particular moment in history, poised between medieval certainty and something new struggling to be born. The old ways still held power, the church still dominated thought, but questions were beginning to whisper through the streets. What if the ancients, the Greeks and Romans, had known something worth recovering? What if there were other ways to think about God, about humanity, about the purpose of existence? These questions didn't arrive all at once. They accumulated slowly, like water seeping through stone, patient and persistent. This was the Florence into which our story unfolds, a city of contradictions, of old wealth and new ideas, of deep faith and growing curiosity about the world as it actually was, not just as doctrine said it should be. And it was into this particular city, at this particular moment, that a revolution would quietly begin. To understand Renaissance Florence, we must understand the Medici, the family whose wealth and ambition would fund much of what we now call the Renaissance. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici established the family's fortune in the late 1300s and early 1400s through banking, a profession that walked a delicate line in medieval Europe. The church officially condemned usury, the lending of money at interest. But the growing complexity of European commerce made banking essential. The Medicis and other banking families found acceptable ways to structure loans, and their services became indispensable to merchants, nobles, and even popes. Money flowed through Florence, and the Medicis positioned themselves at the centre of these flows. Giovanni's son, Cosimo, would take the family to new heights of power and influence. Cosimo de' Medici, known as Cosimo the Elder, understood something crucial about power in a republic like Florence. Open displays of ambition invited backlash, created enemies, threatened the delicate balance of guild politics. So Cosimo developed a different approach. He never held the highest offices himself, preferring to exercise influence through others, through favours granted and debts called in, through the soft power of being the man everyone needed. He was exiled once. In 1433, when rivals thought they could break his influence, he returned within a year, more powerful than before, having learned exactly how essential he had become. But what makes Cosimo remarkable for our story is not just his political acumen or his wealth, though both were extraordinary. What matters is what he chose to do with his money and influence. Cosimo became a patron of learning and art on a scale rarely seen. He collected manuscripts, ancient texts that had survived the centuries hidden in monastery libraries or brought from Byzantium by scholars fleeing Ottoman expansion. He funded a Platonic academy, where philosophers could gather and discuss ideas. He commissioned buildings designed by the best architects, filled with sculptures and paintings by the finest artists. He understood that culture could be a kind of power too, that beauty could serve purposes beyond mere decoration. The Medici Palace, built in the 1450s under Cosimo's direction, demonstrated this philosophy perfectly. It was impressive but not ostentatious, grand but not overtly palatial, suggesting wealth without flaunting it in ways that might offend Republican sensibilities. Inside, though, Cosimo gathered treasures, manuscripts in Greek and Latin, ancient wisdom preserved on vellum, sculptures inspired by classical models, paintings that showed the world with new accuracy. The palace became a centre of cultural life, a place where artists and scholars gathered under Medici protection. This pattern of patronage would define Florence for generations. The Medici set an example that other wealthy families would follow. To be powerful in Florence meant being a patron, meant supporting artists and thinkers, meant surrounding yourself with beautiful things and learned conversation. This created an ecosystem where talent could flourish. If you were a skilled artist or a brilliant scholar, Florence was where you wanted to be, because Florence was where the money was and where money was willing to be spent on art and learning. Cosimo died in 1464, having shaped Florence so thoroughly that his influence would outlast him by centuries. His grandson Lorenzo would become even more famous as Lorenzo the Magnificent, the very model of a Renaissance prince. But Cosimo laid the foundation, created the template, showed how wealth could be transformed into culture, how gold could be turned into marble and paint and thought. The Medici Bank would eventually fail, brought down by bad loans and political miscalculation. But the investment in culture would prove more durable than any financial empire, and that investment was about to pay dividends that no one could have predicted. While the Medicis were building their fortune, something else was happening that would prove equally important to the Renaissance. Ancient texts lost for centuries in Western Europe were finding their way back into Italian hands. The story of these texts is the story of a 1,000-year interruption. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, much of classical learning vanished with it. Libraries were destroyed or abandoned. Texts were lost. The Church preserved what it deemed important, mostly Christian writings, but much of the classical world's philosophy, literature and science simply disappeared from Western European consciousness. Some survived in Arabic translation, preserved by Islamic scholars who valued this knowledge when Europe did not. Some lingered in Eastern monasteries, copied and recopied by monks who might not even read the languages they were preserving, but in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. This catastrophe for Byzantium proved ironically a catalyst for the Italian Renaissance. Byzantine scholars fled westward, carrying with them manuscripts they'd protected for generations. They brought Plato in the original Greek. They brought playwrights and poets and historians that Western Europe had forgotten, or knew only through fragments and summaries. They brought texts on mathematics and geometry, on optics and natural philosophy. Florence, with its wealth and its growing hunger for knowledge, became a magnet for these scholars and their precious manuscripts. Cosimo de' Medici funded the collection and translation of these works. He established a library and an academy dedicated to studying them. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino spent decades translating Plato's complete works into Latin, making them accessible to Western readers for the first time in 800 years. Imagine discovering an entirely new way of thinking about the soul, about love, about the relationship between the physical world and ideal forms. Imagine finding out that the ancients had asked profound questions and developed sophisticated answers that Christianity had neither preserved nor entirely contradicted. This recovery of ancient texts did something subtle but revolutionary to how educated people thought about their own time. The medieval worldview had assumed that human history was a story of decline from Eden, that the present was necessarily inferior to the past, and that perfection lay only in heaven beyond this fallen world. But here were texts from pagan antiquity that showed humans thinking clearly, creating beauty, understanding nature, building extraordinary things. If the ancients could achieve such heights without Christian revelation, what did that say about human potential? What if human beings had capacities that didn't require divine intervention to activate? This wasn't necessarily a rejection of Christianity. Many Renaissance thinkers, including Ficino, worked hard to reconcile Platonic philosophy with Christian theology. But it opened space for a different emphasis, a focus on human dignity and capability that would profoundly influence how artists approach their work. If humans were made in God's image, and if that meant we shared something of divine creative power, then perhaps creating beautiful art was itself a form of worship, a celebration of the gifts God had given. The texts also provided practical knowledge. Ancient writers on optics explained how light behaved, information artists could use to paint more convincingly. Texts on human anatomy, though often wrong in details, encouraged looking closely at actual bodies. Mathematical treatises explored proportion and geometry, the foundations of perspective. The recovery of this ancient knowledge didn't just change what people thought, it changed what they could do. In workshops across Florence, artists began experimenting with these ideas. They studied ancient sculptures, noting how the Greeks and Romans had captured human form. They read Vitruvius on architecture and proportion. They absorbed the classical belief that beauty arose from mathematical relationships, from harmony and balance you could actually calculate. The books from Byzantium carried more than just words on pages. They carried permission to imagine differently, to ask questions, to value human achievement. And in Florence, full of ambition and wealth and talent, that permission would be seized with both hands. In 1418, the overseers of Florence Cathedral faced an embarrassing problem. Their church had been under construction for over a century, and now they needed to dome the crossing to cap the enormous octagonal space where the nave met the transepts. But there was a difficulty. No one knew how to build a dome that large. The opening measured 140 feet across, bigger than any dome successfully constructed since antiquity. The Pantheon in Rome had managed it, but that was 1300 years ago, and the techniques were lost. Enter Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith and sculptor who had lost a famous competition to design the baptistery doors, but had found himself fascinated by engineering and architecture. Brunelleschi had travelled to Rome and spent years studying ancient ruins, measuring the Pantheon, trying to understand how the Romans had achieved their engineering marvels. He came back to Florence convinced he could build the dome. The problem was structural. A dome that large would require enormous wooden scaffolding to support it during construction, scaffolding that might cost as much as the dome itself, and the weight would be tremendous. How do you build something that heavy without it collapsing under its own mass before the mortar even dries? Traditional methods wouldn't work at this scale. Brunelleschi proposed something radical. He would build two domes, an inner and outer shell linked by hidden ribs. He would lay the bricks in a herringbone pattern that would make each course support itself as it rose. He would use different materials at different heights. Lighter stone and eventually just brick as the dome climbed higher, and he would do it all without the massive wooden scaffolding everyone assumed was necessary. The cathedral overseers were sceptical. This sounded impossible. Brunelleschi, never one to suffer fools gladly, refused to explain his methods in detail, fearing others would steal his ideas. The debates went on for years. Eventually, desperate and out of better options, they hired him. Construction began in 1420. The work took 16 years. Brunelleschi invented new hoisting machines to lift materials. He designed platforms that hung from the dome itself so workers wouldn't have to climb down for lunch or breaks. He personally supervised the laying of bricks, checking that each one contributed to the pattern that would make the whole structure stable. Florentines watched their dome rise year by year, this impossible thing growing against the sky, proof that their city could accomplish what others deemed undoable. When the dome was finished in 1436, it was a sensation. Nothing like it had been built in living memory or in the memory of anyone's grandparents. It dominated the Florence skyline, visible from miles away, a declaration in brick and stone that Florence was special, chosen, capable of miracles. Brunelleschi had not just solved an engineering problem. He had given Florence a symbol, something that said the city could reach heights others couldn't imagine. But the dome mattered for another reason too. It demonstrated that ancient knowledge could be recovered and even surpassed. Brunelleschi had studied Roman engineering, but he'd created something the Romans never built, a dome of this scale without their construction methods. He'd proved that moderns could innovate, could take old knowledge and push beyond it. This was an intoxicating idea. If Brunelleschi could outdo the ancients in engineering, what might others achieve in painting, sculpture, philosophy? The dome also changed how artists thought about problems. Brunelleschi had approached cathedral construction as a challenge requiring new solutions, new methods, new thinking. He'd refused to be bound by tradition or conventional wisdom. This attitude, this willingness to experiment and innovate would spread to other arts. It encouraged risk-taking, trying techniques no one had proven yet, pushing boundaries, and Brunelleschi had one more gift to give Florence, one more revolution to unleash. While working on the dome, he'd been conducting experiments with mirrors and perspective, trying to understand how three-dimensional space could be represented on a flat surface. What he discovered would change painting forever. Imagine standing in front of a painting from the early 1400s, before Brunelleschi's experiments with perspective. You'd see figures arranged in a composition, often with important people larger than less important ones, regardless of where they stood in the scene. The background might be gold leaf, a shimmering non-space that suggested heaven more than any earthly location. Depth was implied through convention, through overlapping figures, or perhaps a smaller size for things meant to be farther away. But there was no mathematical system, no way to make the space feel truly three-dimensional and consistent. Brunelleschi changed this with a deceptively simple experiment. He painted a picture of the Florence baptistery on a wooden panel, then drilled a small hole through it at what we would call the vanishing point. Standing in the exact spot where he'd made the painting, he held it up facing away from him and held a mirror in front of it. Looking through the hole from behind, he could see the reflection of his painting and compare it to the real building. They matched. He had found a way to transfer three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface with perfect mathematical accuracy. The principle was this. Imagine all the sightlines from your eye to various points in a scene. They converge at your eye like spokes to a hub. If you slice through those sightlines with a flat plane, that's your picture. Everything on that plane can be positioned according to geometric rules. Lines that are parallel in the real world converge to a single point in the picture, the vanishing point. The further away something is, the closer it appears to that point. You can calculate exactly where everything should go using simple geometry. This was revolutionary. For the first time, artists had a tool that let them create convincing space. They could show buildings receding into the distance. They could place figures in settings that felt real, where you could almost measure the distance between them. Viewers would look at these paintings and feel like they were looking through a window into an actual place, not at a symbolic representation on a flat surface. Word of Brunelleschi's technique spread through Florence's artistic community. Masaccio, a young painter, was among the first to grasp its full potential. In 1427, he painted a fresco of the Trinity in the church of Santa Maria Novella. The painting shows Christ on the cross beneath a barrel-vaulted ceiling, with God the Father supporting the cross and Mary and John standing to the sides. But what startled viewers was the architecture. Masaccio had painted it in perfect perspective. The vault receded convincingly into the wall. You could measure the relationships between elements. One early viewer reportedly exclaimed that it looked like a hole had been punched through the church wall, revealing an actual chapel beyond. Perspective became a marker of artistic sophistication. Learning to construct a proper perspective became part of artistic training. Artists would lay out elaborate grids, carefully plotting where every element should fall. The technique took time to master. Some artists initially made mistakes, creating perspectives with multiple vanishing points or inconsistent spacing, but gradually the method became standard practice, something every serious artist needed to know. The impact went beyond mere technique, though. Perspective changed what painting could be about. With convincing space, you could tell complex narratives showing multiple actions happening at different locations in a single scene. You could create architectural settings that reinforced meaning, using the geometry itself to draw the eye to important elements. You could show the world as it appeared to human vision, grounding religious scenes in spaces that felt touchably real. And perhaps most profoundly, perspective embodied a humanist idea. It placed the viewer's eye at the centre of the visual system. Everything in the picture was organised from that single viewpoint. This was different from medieval painting, which often showed different things from different angles in the same image, creating a kind of impossible composite space that somehow worked symbolically. Perspective painting said the human viewpoint mattered, that how things appeared to us was valid and worth capturing accurately. It was a small shift in one sense. Just a technique, just a tool. But it reflected and reinforced a larger change in how people thought about their relationship to the world around them. And in workshops throughout Florence, artists were learning to use this tool to create things no one had ever quite seen before. Donato di Niccolò di Bettobardi, known to history as Donatello, began his career in the first years of the 1500s. Trained in the workshop of Lorenzo Ghiberti. But where Ghiberti's work showed elegant refinement and careful decoration, Donatello's sculptures had something else, something harder to name. They seemed alive in a way sculpture hadn't been for over 1,000 years. Consider his marble David, carved around 1408 when Donatello was barely into his 20s. It shows the young hero after defeating Goliath, one foot resting on the giant's severed head. Earlier depictions of David had shown him as a symbol of virtue, idealized and generalized. Donatello's David is specific, individual, a young man caught in a particular moment. You can see thought in his face, not just generic triumph, but something more complex, perhaps the weight of what he's just done beginning to settle on him. The body shows the anatomical knowledge that would become typical of Renaissance sculpture, muscles and skeleton visible beneath skin rendered in stone. But Donatello's real breakthrough came with bronze. In the 1430s, he completed what's simply known as Donatello's David, the first freestanding nude male sculpture since antiquity. Bronze allowed Donatello to do things marble couldn't. He could create more delicate forms, could show David's youth more convincingly. The statue stands contrapposto, weight on one leg, in the classical manner, but David's body is unideal by classical standards, still boyish, not yet fully developed. He wears nothing but a hat and boots, one foot still resting on Goliath's head, and he looks down with an expression that artists and viewers have been trying to interpret for 600 years. Is it satisfaction? Contemplation? Something more ambiguous? The statue's nudity was deliberate and meaningful. Donatello was reaching back to classical precedent, to the Greek and Roman practice of showing the heroic nude body. But he was adapting it, making it his own. This David wasn't an idealized athlete. He was recognizably human, specific, individual, caught at a particular age in a particular moment. The statue suggests that the classical past could be recovered but didn't need to be copied exactly. You could take its principles and apply them to your own vision. Later in his career, working in Padua, Donatello would create his Gattamelata, an equestrian statue of a mercenary captain. It was the first bronze equestrian statue since antiquity, another conscious revival of classical forms. The horse alone was a marvel of casting, but what struck viewers was the figure of Gattamelata himself. Sitting easy in the saddle, radiating calm authority, Donatello made bronze convey personality, character, the specific qualities that made this particular man worth commemorating. In his old age, Donatello's work became more emotional, more expressive, sometimes almost painful in its intensity. His wooden Mary Magdalene shows the saint as an elderly woman wasted by fasting and penance, her face carved with deep emotion, her hands clasped in prayer. It's not beautiful in conventional terms, it's powerful, moving, almost hard to look at because it's so psychologically raw. Donatello was using sculpture to explore the full range of human experience and emotion, not just beauty or heroism, but suffering, age, spiritual intensity. Through all these works runs a common thread. Donatello believed sculpture should capture not just bodies, but souls. Should show us not just what people look like, but who they are. He studied ancient sculpture intensely, learned from it, borrowed from it. But he wasn't trying to recreate the past. He was using everything he learned to make sculptures that felt present, immediate, that had the weight and complexity of actual human beings frozen in stone or cast in bronze. His influence on younger sculptors was immense. Anyone working in Florence would have known Donatello's work, would have studied it, learned from it. He showed what was possible, set a standard that others would try to match or surpass. When Michelangelo was a young man, Donatello had been dead for decades, but his sculptures were still there, still teaching, still showing what it meant to make stone breathe. The best artists, Donatello understood, don't just master a craft, they used that craft to reveal something true about being human. And in Florence, surrounded by others pushing the same boundaries, that understanding would produce wonders. Not all Renaissance art was about human achievement or classical revival. Fra Giovanni da Fiesole, known as Fra Angelico, painted beauty in service of the divine, and in doing so created some of the most serene works of the entire Renaissance. Fra Angelico was a Dominican friar, deeply religious, committed to his order and its mission. When he painted, he was praying with pigment. His subjects were almost exclusively religious, scenes from the life of Christ and the saints, the Annunciation, the crucifixion, the lives of martyrs. But the way he painted them incorporated all the new techniques of the early Renaissance while maintaining a spiritual quality that set his work apart. In the 1430s and 40s, Fra Angelico painted frescoes for the convent of San Marco in Florence, a building renovated by Michelangelo under Cosimo de' Medici's patronage. Each cell where the friars slept received a fresco, a devotional image to focus prayer and contemplation. These weren't grand public statements. They were intimate, meant to be seen in silence and solitude by one person at a time. Fra Angelico adapted his style to this purpose. His Annunciations, painted multiple times throughout the convent, show the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary in simple, elegant spaces. The colours are soft, the figures graceful, the whole effect calm and contemplative. There's no drama, no visible struggle, just the quiet moment when history changed. Rendered with profound tenderness, Fra Angelico used perspective, understood anatomy, employed all the technical innovations of his time, but he subordinated technique to spiritual purpose. He wanted viewers to feel the sacred, to be drawn into prayer, to sense the presence of the divine. His paintings don't draw attention to their own skill. They're transparent somehow, asking you to look not at the painting, but through it to the sacred reality it represents. His colour was extraordinary. The blues especially, achieved through expensive ultramarine pigment made from lapis lazuli, have a depth and luminosity that seems to glow from within. Gold still appears in his work, not as a flat medieval background, but as halos and highlights, catching light the way actual gold would. The combination creates a sense of otherworldliness without abandoning naturalism. These spaces obey the rules of perspective, these bodies have weight and volume, but they're also somehow not quite of this world, touched by grace. For the main altarpiece of San Marco, Fra Angelico painted a Madonna and Child, surrounded by saints, in what's called a Sacra Conversazione, a holy conversation. The saints stand in a believable architectural space, but their poses and expressions suggest deep communion with the sacred. St. Dominic kneels reading, St. Cosmas and Damian stand as patrons, St. Peter Martyr gestures toward the viewer. Each figure is individualized, specific, yet all exist in this calm harmony. The painting invites contemplation, creates a space where prayer feels natural. What makes Fra Angelico remarkable is how he balanced innovation with devotion. He could have painted in the older style, the flatter medieval manner. Some of his contemporary fellow friars might have considered that more appropriately humble, but Fra Angelico understood that new techniques could serve old purposes, that showing the world more accurately didn't diminish the sacred but could reveal it more clearly. If God created the world and declared it good, then depicting it accurately was itself a form of praise. His work reminds us that the Renaissance wasn't just secular or humanist or classical. For many artists, including some of the finest, it was about using new understanding and new skills to approach old truths more deeply. Fra Angelico painted the same subjects medieval artists had painted for centuries: the Madonna and Child, the crucifixion, the lives of saints. But he painted them with a clarity and emotional depth that made viewers feel they were witnessing these events freshly, seeing them truly for the first time. When he died in 1455 in Rome, where he'd been working on commissions for the Pope, his fellow Dominicans mourned a holy man as much as a great artist. The combination wasn't contradictory to them. Fra Angelico had shown that artistry and sanctity could enhance each other, that beauty in service of the sacred was itself a holy thing. His frescoes still survive in San Marco, still create those moments of quiet contemplation he intended. Walk through those cells today, and you can still feel what he was reaching for: peace, beauty, the presence of grace made visible. By the 1460s and 70s, under Lorenzo de' Medici's guidance, Florence had developed a full ecosystem for nurturing artistic talent. Workshops trained apprentices, wealthy patrons commissioned works, and the city itself served as a constant exhibition of the best that human creativity could achieve. But Lorenzo, called the Magnificent for his patronage as much as his politics, created something new. He established what amounted to an art school, a garden where talented young artists could study classical sculpture and learn from each other. The Medici Sculpture Garden near San Marco gathered ancient Roman sculptures Lorenzo had collected and commissioned, copies of works that couldn't be moved. Young artists could come and study these pieces, learning anatomy and proportion from the ancients themselves. Bertoldo di Giovanni, one of Donatello's students, oversaw the garden, providing guidance and instruction. But the real education came from immersion in excellence, from spending days studying how the Romans had carved muscle and bone, how they had captured movement in stone, how they had made marble suggest flesh. Two young men in particular would benefit from Lorenzo's garden, both arriving as teenagers, both destined to become giants. Michelangelo Buonarroti came from a family that considered itself noble, though impoverished. His father objected to a son becoming an artisan, but Michelangelo's obsession with drawing couldn't be denied. He entered Ghirlandaio's workshop at 13, then moved to the sculpture garden at 15, where Lorenzo immediately recognized his talent. The young Michelangelo would sit for hours studying a fawn's head, copying every detail until Bertoldo suggested he open the mouth wider, show the teeth. Michelangelo did, and the result so impressed Lorenzo that he invited the teenager to live in the Medici palace itself, treated as almost a member of the family. Leonardo da Vinci had already left Florence by the time the garden was at its height. But he'd benefited from a similar system of patronage and education in Verrocchio's workshop years earlier. These informal institutions, somewhere between family businesses and true academies, allowed talent to flourish. A boy showing aptitude would be apprenticed young, living with the master, learning first by grinding pigments and preparing surfaces, gradually working up to drawing, then painting backgrounds, then finally being trusted with significant portions of commissioned works. The master benefited from cheap labour that became increasingly skilled. The apprentice learned not just technique but everything about running an artistic practice, from dealing with clients to sourcing materials to managing large projects. Lorenzo's garden took this model and elevated it. The young artists there weren't just learning a trade, they were being formed in a particular tradition, exposed to the best of classical art, encouraged to think of themselves as continuing and even surpassing ancient achievements. This confidence would mark the generation that came of age in Lorenzo's Florence. They didn't just want to equal ancient artists, they wanted to exceed them, to prove that modern humans could match or surpass anything the ancients had done. The garden also brought talented young people together, creating friendships and rivalries that would last lifetimes. Michelangelo met other sculptors there, saw what they were capable of, measured himself against them. This competitive but supportive environment pushed everyone to improve. You couldn't coast on minimal effort when the person working next to you was producing something extraordinary. The presence of ancient sculptures provided objective standards. Could you carve a torso as well as the Roman whose work stood before you? Could you capture motion as convincingly? Could you make stone speak the way those long-dead masters had? Lorenzo himself would visit the garden, examine works in progress, discuss art and philosophy with the young artists. For Michelangelo especially, this exposure to humanist learning, to the Platonic philosophy Ficino had translated, would profoundly influence his artistic vision. He began to see sculpture not just as craft, but as philosophy made visible, as a way of embodying Platonic ideals of beauty and truth. The garden existed for only a few years before Lorenzo's death in 1492 disrupted everything, but its impact would last for centuries. It represented a new way of thinking about artistic education, about the value of studying the past to create new work, about bringing talented people together and giving them resources and freedom to develop. And two of its students, Michelangelo and the slightly older Leonardo, would go on to change art so fundamentally that everything after would be measured against what they achieved. The garden was where they began to understand what they might become. While artists were transforming how humans depicted the world, philosophers in Florence were transforming how humans thought about themselves. The humanist movement, centered in Florence and drawing on the recovered ancient texts, developed a vision of human nature that would profoundly influence both art and thought for centuries. The term "zero" itself comes from Studia Humanitatis, the humanities, the study of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. But Renaissance humanism meant more than just studying these subjects. It meant believing that human beings had dignity, capability, and potential that deserved celebration. This wasn't necessarily a rejection of Christianity. Many humanists, including Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, worked to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian theology. But it did shift emphasis, placing human achievement and potential alongside divine grace as subjects worthy of contemplation. Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man, written in 1486 when Pico was only 23, captures this spirit perfectly. Pico imagined God speaking to Adam at creation, telling him that unlike other creatures who were given fixed natures, humans were free to become whatever they chose. We could ascend to angelic heights or descend to bestial lows. Our nature wasn't determined. We were, in Pico's vision, self-creating beings, responsible for shaping ourselves through our choices and actions. This was a radical idea, one that placed enormous responsibility on human shoulders, but also enormous possibility. Ficino's translations of Plato had introduced Florentine thinkers to ancient ideas about love, beauty, and the soul. Platonic philosophy suggested that earthly beauty was a reflection of ideal beauty, that loving beautiful things could lead the soul upward toward contemplation of pure beauty itself, ultimately toward God. This gave philosophical grounding to the artistic focus on beauty and idealization. Creating beautiful art wasn't frivolous or mere decoration. It was participating in something sacred, making visible the ideal forms that existed in the divine mind. These ideas circulated in discussions at the Platonic Academy Cosimo had founded, in conversations in the Medici Palace, in letters between scholars across Italy. Florence became a centre for this new learning, attracting thinkers who wanted to be part of the conversations happening there. The intellectual ferment was as important as the artistic innovation, and the two fed each other. Artists like Botticelli absorbed humanist philosophy and incorporated it into their work. Philosophers looked to artists as exemplars of human creative potential. The humanist emphasis on individual dignity also changed educational priorities. Rather than focusing exclusively on theological training, humanist educators advocated for broader learning, the study of classical languages and literature, the development of eloquence and moral reasoning. An educated person, in the humanist view, should be well-rounded, capable of engaging with the full range of human knowledge and experience. This ideal would influence European education for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, humanism suggested that this life, this world, mattered. Medieval thought had often emphasized the vanity of earthly existence, the corruption of the material world, the importance of focusing on the salvation of the soul and the life to come. Humanists didn't reject these ideas, but they balanced them with appreciation for earthly beauty, for human achievement, for the goods of this life. a well-lived human life had value in itself, not just as preparation for eternity. The paintings and sculptures and buildings we created had worth beyond their religious function. They testified to human capability, to our God-given gifts expressed through work and skill. This created a different emotional atmosphere. Life wasn't just suffering to be endured while awaiting heaven or hell. It was an opportunity, a chance to develop our capacities, to create beauty, to contribute to human flourishing. This didn't make Renaissance Florence a secular society. Faith remained central for most people, but it made space for valuing human things alongside divine ones, for seeing achievement and beauty as compatible with piety rather than opposed to it. Artists working in this atmosphere could approach their craft with a new confidence. They weren't just decorating churches or fulfilling commissions. They were participating in humanity's highest calling, the creation of beauty and the expression of our divine image-bearing nature. This helps explain the ambition you see in Renaissance art, the willingness to attempt things no one had done before, the confidence that human skill could capture truth and beauty in lasting form. The dignity of man wasn't an abstract philosophical position. It was a lived reality in Florence, embodied in art and building and thought, visible in the way talented people approached their work, and it would soon produce masterpieces that justified all that confidence. Sandro Botticelli arrived at artistic maturity in Lorenzo the Magnificent's Florence, absorbing both artistic technique and humanist philosophy. His paintings, particularly those created for the Medici, would embody the synthesis of classical learning and Christian culture that characterized the Florentine Renaissance at its height. Botticelli's early training was conventional enough. He apprenticed with Fra Filippo Lippi, learning the craft of painting, mastering egg tempera on panel, studying how to render drapery in human form. But Botticelli's mature work shows the influence of something beyond technical training. His paintings have a dreamlike quality, a lyrical grace that sets them apart from contemporaries who are pursuing more muscular or dramatic styles. His figures seem to float more than stand, their drapery flowing in winds that exist only in the painting's imagined space. The Birth of Venus, painted in the mid-1480s for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent's cousin, remains Botticelli's most famous work. It shows the goddess Venus arriving on shore on a giant scallop shell, blown by wind gods while a nymph waits with a flowered cloak. The subject is entirely pagan, drawn from classical mythology, with no Christian content at all. This was revolutionary. Religious subjects still dominated painting, but Botticelli created a large-scale mythological work treated with the seriousness usually reserved for sacred scenes. The painting embodies Neoplatonic philosophy. Venus represents divine love and ideal beauty, her nudity evoking classical sculpture rather than suggesting anything erotic. The humanists around Lorenzo had developed interpretations of classical myths that made them compatible with Christianity. Venus could be read as a symbol of divine love, her birth from the sea as a metaphor for the soul's journey. This allowed educated viewers to appreciate classical subjects as something more than mere decoration or frivolous mythology. Botticelli's technique reinforced the painting's otherworldly quality. The figures are outlined sharply, almost like drawings coloured in, giving them a slight flatness despite his knowledge of perspective and volume. This wasn't incompetence. It was a choice, creating a deliberate effect that made the scene feel mythic rather than naturalistic. Venus stands in contrapposto, her pose reminiscent of ancient sculpture, but Botticelli elongates her proportions slightly, makes her more graceful than anatomically precise. The overall effect is beauty idealized, beauty as Platonic form rather than earthly flesh. The Primavera, painted a few years earlier, is even more complex and mysterious. It shows multiple figures in an orange grove, a garden scene loaded with symbolic meaning that scholars still debate. Venus stands at centre, presiding over a scene that includes the three Graces, Mercury, Flora, and other figures from classical mythology. Orange trees bloom overhead, Flowers carpet the ground, the whole scene suggesting perpetual spring, eternal fertility, the triumph of beauty and love. Like the Birth of Venus, it was commissioned by the Medici and decorated a private space rather than a public building or church. These paintings represent something remarkable. In medieval art, classical mythology appeared rarely and usually with disapproval as examples of pagan error. But Botticelli and his Medici patrons treated classical myths as sources of beauty and meaning, subjects worthy of the finest artistic treatment. This represented humanism's project of recovering and valuing the classical past while integrating it into Christian culture. You could appreciate Venus without worshipping her. You could find truth and beauty in pagan myths without abandoning Christian faith. Botticelli also painted numerous religious works, altarpieces and devotional panels showing the Madonna and Child, the adoration of the Magi, various saints. His religious paintings have the same lyrical quality as his mythological ones, suggesting that for Botticelli the sacred and the beautiful were intimately connected. Whether painting Venus or the Virgin Mary, he was reaching for the same ideal grace, the same sense of beauty as a window into something transcendent. Late in Botticelli's career, Florence would change dramatically. The firebrand preacher Savonarola would denounce worldly art and luxury. Botticelli, influenced by the preacher's message, would burn some of his own paintings in the famous bonfire of the Vanities. His later works would become more austere, more openly religious, less concerned with classical beauty. But his mythological paintings survived, and they continue to speak to what Florence had achieved, the synthesis of ancient wisdom and Christian faith, of human beauty and divine truth. In Botticelli's work, classical learning and Christian culture didn't just coexist. They enhanced each other, created something neither could produce alone, and for a few decades in 15th century Florence, that synthesis seemed not just possible but natural, the obvious direction for human culture to take. Tommaso di Ser Giovanni di Simone, called Masaccio, lived only 27 years, dying in 1428 possibly from plague or poison, the exact cause lost to history. But in his brief career, he changed painting so fundamentally that everything after looks different. Before Masaccio, even the most skilled painters treated figures somewhat as separate elements composed into a scene. Beautiful, certainly, increasingly naturalistic, but still arranged rather than fully inhabiting space. Masaccio painted figures that existed in space, that had weight and volume, that interacted with light the way actual bodies do. He combined Brunelleschi's perspective with an understanding of a light and mass that made painted spaces feel real in unprecedented ways. The Brancacci Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine contains Masaccio's greatest surviving work, a series of frescoes showing scenes from the life of St. Peter. The tribute money, one of the most famous, demonstrates everything that made Masaccio revolutionary. Christ stands at centre with his disciples gathered around him, while a tax collector demands payment. The scene happens in a believable landscape, hills receding into the distance. Buildings placed according to perspective. But what's remarkable is the figures themselves. They have weight. You can see the bodies beneath the drapery, understand how they're standing, sense the pull of gravity on their forms. The light comes from a single source, the chapel's actual window, and Masaccio painted shadows and highlights as if that light were really falling on these figures. The modelling, the way he used gradations of tone to suggest three-dimensional form, gives each figure sculptural presence. These aren't paintings of people, these are people, rendered in paint with such conviction that viewers feel they could walk around them. The faces show emotion and personality. Peter's expression as Christ tells him where to find a coin to pay the tax combines doubt and faith. The tax collector's face shows bureaucratic insistence. Each disciple has individual features, a specific human being rather than a generalized holy man. Masaccio was bringing portraiture's attention to individual identity into narrative painting, making even minor figures in the story into distinct persons. In another fresco, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, Masaccio painted Adam and Eve being driven from paradise. Earlier depictions of this scene showed the figures in formal poses, often covering their nakedness decorously. Masaccio showed raw anguish. Eve's face tilts up, mouth open in a cry of grief. Adam covers his face in shame. Their bodies sag with despair, and their nudity isn't idealized. These are real humans confronting catastrophe, and the emotional truth of the moment comes through with shocking power. Masaccio made religious narratives immediate and human, grounding them in recognizable emotion. He died so young that we can only imagine what he might have achieved with another 20 or 30 years. But what he accomplished in his brief career was enough to change painting's trajectory. Artists who came after, including Leonardo and Michelangelo, studied the Brancacci Chapel carefully, learning from Masaccio's treatment of light and form. His innovations became foundational, things every serious painter needed to master. The gap between medieval painting and Renaissance painting runs right through Masaccio's work. Before him, painting was moving toward naturalism. After him, naturalism became the standard, the baseline from which further innovations would launch. What made Masaccio remarkable wasn't just technical skill, though he had that in abundance. It was his understanding that technique should serve emotional and spiritual truth. He could paint convincing space and solid bodies, but he used those abilities to make viewers feel something, to make biblical narratives immediate and real. The expulsion from Eden happened to these specific people, whose grief we can recognize because we felt grief ourselves. The disciples listening to Christ are individuals we might meet, human beings trying to understand something that will change their lives. Masaccio showed that painting could be both technically sophisticated and emotionally powerful, that naturalism wasn't just about copying appearances but about revealing truth. He gave subsequent artists both methods and purpose, showing them not just how to paint but why it mattered. His early death was a tragedy for art, but his brief legacy proved sufficient to spark a revolution that would continue long after his death. And the revolution would produce wonders he could scarcely have imagined. To understand Renaissance art, we need to understand how it was actually made, the daily reality of workshops where masterpieces emerged from organized labor and careful training. An established master's workshop was part business, part school, part extended family. The master, having achieved recognition and attracted patrons, would maintain a physical space, usually ground floor of a building, with living quarters above. Apprentices would live there, boys from around 10 to 14 years old sent by families who paid for their training. In return for room, board and education, the apprentices provided labour, starting with the most menial tasks and gradually working up to more skilled work. The youngest apprentices ground pigments, a tedious but essential task. Minerals and plants had to be reduced to fine powder, then mixed with binding medium, either egg yolk for tempera painting or oils for the newer oil painting technique. They learned to prepare wooden panels, applying gesso in multiple layers, sanding between coats until the surface was perfectly smooth. They stretched and prepared canvases, mixed plaster for frescoes, maintained tools, cleaned the workshop. This wasn't wasted time. By handling materials daily, they learned their properties, understood what different pigments could do, absorbed the craft at a physical level. As they showed aptitude, they'd begin drawing, copying the master's drawings and works by other artists. Drawing was fundamental, the foundation of all visual arts. They draw from casts of classical sculptures, learning proportion and anatomy. They draw from life when possible, though live models were expensive and not always available. They'd fill pages with hands and feet and faces, the elements that appeared in every painting and needed to be rendered convincingly. The master would correct their work, demonstrate techniques, gradually build their skills. After several years, a promising apprentice might be allowed to paint backgrounds or minor figures in the master's works. The master would execute the important parts, the main figures' faces and hands, the portions where quality mattered most. The apprentice's work would be supervised and corrected until it met the workshop standards. This system meant that many famous masters actually included substantial contributions by assistants. But the master's vision and quality control ensured consistency. The painting that left the workshop represented the master's standard, even if multiple hands had contributed. Commissions came through various routes. Churches needed altarpieces and frescoes. Wealthy individuals wanted devotional panels for private chapels. Confraternities, religious brotherhoods, commissioned works for their meeting halls. Contracts were detailed, specifying subject matter, size, materials, sometimes even which pigments must be used. Ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli, was expensive, and contracts often stipulated its use for important elements like the Madonna's robe. Gold leaf had to be real gold, not cheaper substitutes. The patron was paying for quality and wanted guarantees. The workshop operated as a business. The master negotiated prices, managed multiple commissions simultaneously, balanced artistic vision with patron demands and practical constraints. Some workshops specialized in certain types of work. Some were known for frescoes, others for panel paintings, some for sculpture. Larger workshops might take on architectural projects or design tapestries and other decorative works. The master's reputation determined how much they could charge and how selective they could be about commissions. Competition was intense. Florence had dozens of active workshops, and patrons could choose among many skilled artists. This drove quality up. You couldn't coast on minimal effort when other workshops were producing extraordinary work. The cathedral project, the various churches being built or renovated, the wealthy families competing through artistic patronage, all this created steady demand for skilled artistic labour. If you were talented and well-trained, you could make a good living. The most successful masters became wealthy, owned property, had influence beyond their art. But the workshop system also created community. Apprentices formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. Masters collaborated on large projects, bringing together multiple workshops' labour. Artists studied each other's work, learned from it, incorporated successful innovations into their own practice. The concentration of talent in Florence meant that even casual conversations might involve discussions of technique or aesthetic theory. Artistic knowledge circulated freely, everyone building on everyone else's achievements. This system produced the Renaissance. Not lone geniuses working in isolation, but skilled craftsmen trained thoroughly in traditional techniques and then pushed by competition and opportunity to innovate, to attempt things no one had quite achieved before. The masterpieces emerged from this combination of rigorous training, organised labour, competitive pressure, and genuine artistic vision. And Florence had created the perfect environment for all of it to flourish. We return to Botticelli, but now to understand not just individual works, but what his career reveals about the possibilities and tensions in Lorenzo's Florence. By the 1480s, Botticelli had become one of Florence's most sought-after painters. The Medici commissioned works from him regularly. Other wealthy families wanted his distinctive style for their own palaces. He painted religious subjects for churches and mythological scenes for private collectors. His workshop was successful, his reputation secure. He embodied the successful Renaissance artist. Trained in traditional methods but incorporating new techniques and classical learning into a personal vision. His mythological paintings for the Medici weren't just decorations. They were sophisticated intellectual statements, coded references to Neoplatonic philosophy that educated viewers would have recognized and appreciated. The Primavera, still mysterious to modern scholars, would have been comprehensible to someone versed in Ficino's interpretations of classical myth. Every figure, every botanical element, every gesture contributed to a complex allegory about love, beauty, and virtue. These paintings rewarded close study, revealed more the more you understood the philosophical framework behind them. This was art for an elite. For people educated in classical literature and contemporary philosophy, it represented the high point of the Florentine synthesis, where ancient learning and Christian culture and artistic innovation all reinforced each other. If you were part of that educated elite, Florence in the 1480s must have seemed like the summit of human achievement. A new Athens where beauty and wisdom flourished under enlightened patronage. But there were tensions beneath this glittering surface. Florence's wealth came partly from banking and trade practices that some considered usurious. The city's republican forms concealed oligarchic reality, a few families controlling politics through networks of patronage and influence. Inequality was stark. While the Medici and their circle enjoyed unprecedented luxury, many Florentines struggled. The church, though a patron of art, was also criticised for corruption and worldliness. Some felt that Florence had strayed from Christian simplicity, that all this beauty and learning and wealth were distractions from salvation. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar, arrived in Florence in 1490 and began preaching against worldliness and corruption. Initially a voice crying in the wilderness, he gained followers as political instability grew. When Lorenzo died in 1492, the stabilising force of his patronage and political skill vanished. 2 years later, when the Medici were expelled from Florence, Savonarola emerged as the city's spiritual and political leader, establishing what he called a Christian republic. Savonarola preached against vanity, luxury, and pagan learning. He organised the famous Bonfire of the Vanities in 1497, where Florentines burned books, paintings, musical instruments, anything deemed worldly or pagan. Botticelli, who had painted pagan gods and goddesses with such tender beauty, fell under Savonarola's influence. He reportedly threw some of his own paintings onto the bonfire, repudiating his earlier celebration of classical beauty. His late paintings show this change. The mystic Nativity, painted around 1500, includes an inscription suggesting Botticelli believed he was living in the end times. The composition is deliberately archaic. Rejecting the spatial realism and classical beauty of his earlier work in favour of a more medieval symbolic approach. It's still a remarkable painting, but it represents a retreat from the Renaissance synthesis, a return to older values and styles. Savonarola himself was executed in 1498, burned at the stake for heresy. But his brief dominance revealed how fragile the Renaissance consensus was, how many people felt excluded or threatened by the cultural revolution happening around them. The celebration of beauty and human achievement that humanism championed could seem like pride and paganism to those who emphasized sin, judgment, and the need for salvation. Botticelli lived until 1510, surviving into a new century. But his most creative work came before Savonarola's disruption. His late career represents a road not taken, a Renaissance that rejected its own innovations and retreated to medieval certainties. That's not what happened overall. The Renaissance continued, spread, transformed European culture. But Botticelli's trajectory reminds us that cultural change is never inevitable, always contested, that for every person excited by new possibilities, there were others who saw only danger and loss. His mythological paintings survive, Venus and the Primavera and others, testifying to a moment when Florence believed it could reconcile everything, when ancient wisdom and Christian faith seemed not just compatible, but mutually enriching. It was a beautiful dream, and for a while, Florence made it real. The relationship between philosophy and art in Renaissance Florence wasn't superficial or decorative. Artists absorbed philosophical ideas and attempted to make them visible, to create works that embodied complex intellectual positions. Ficino's translations of Plato had introduced concepts about beauty that profoundly influenced how artists thought about their work. Plato's theory of form suggested that earthly things were imperfect copies of ideal forms that existed in a transcendent realm. A beautiful person or object was beautiful because they participated in the ideal form of beauty itself. This gave philosophical grounding to artistic idealization. When an artist painted or sculpted an idealized figure, They weren't falsifying reality, but revealing the ideal form that actual bodies imperfectly reflected. This helps explain why Renaissance artists didn't just copy what they saw. They studied nature carefully, learned anatomy and proportion with scientific precision, but then they modified and idealized, creating figures more perfect than any actual model. They were trying to show the ideal, to make visible the forms that Plato said existed beyond material reality. This wasn't dishonesty. It was revealing truth at a deeper level than surface appearance. The Neoplatonists around Ficino developed an elaborate theory of love and beauty. They distinguished between physical attraction and spiritual love, seeing earthly beauty as a ladder toward divine beauty. Loving a beautiful person could lead the soul to love beauty itself, ultimately leading to love of God. This gave philosophical justification to depicting beautiful bodies, even nude ones. Properly understood, such images could be spiritual aids, reminding viewers of divine beauty through earthly manifestations. Artists also engaged with debates about paragon, the comparison of the arts. Which was superior, painting or sculpture? Painting could show colour and atmospheric effects, could depict vast scenes. Sculpture was three-dimensional, could be viewed from multiple angles, had actual presence in space. Leonardo would argue for painting's supremacy. Michelangelo would champion sculpture. These weren't just professional turf battles. They reflected serious thought about what each art form could achieve, what kinds of truth each could reveal. Michelangelo absorbed Neoplatonic philosophy deeply. For him, sculpture wasn't about imposing form on stone, but revealing the form already present within it. The sculptor's task was to strip away excess marble and free the figure trapped inside. This idea came from Platonic philosophy, the notion that matter concealed ideal forms that the artist must discover and reveal. When you look at Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures, figures that seem to emerge from rough stone, you're seeing this philosophy made visible. The sculptures aren't incomplete. They show the process of revelation, forms struggling to emerge from matter. The same philosophical thinking influenced how artists approached religious subjects. If matter reflected ideal forms, if the physical world participated in divine order, then depicting it accurately was a way of revealing God's design. Studying anatomy became an act of devotion, understanding God's creation more fully. Painting the Madonna wasn't just creating a devotional image, but making visible the ideal of motherhood, the perfect love between mother and child that all earthly mothers imperfectly reflected. This created a feedback loop. Philosophical ideas influenced how artists worked. Artists' works then became visual arguments in philosophical debates, concrete examples that philosophers could point to when discussing beauty, form, or truth. The relationship was genuinely collaborative, each discipline enriching the other. The humanist emphasis on human dignity also shaped artistic choices. If humans bore God's image, if we had the capacity for reason and creativity that distinguished us from animals and resembled divine attributes, then depicting the human form wasn't vanity, but celebration of God's greatest creation. The nude in art, so controversial from a medieval perspective, became philosophically defensible as honest acknowledgement of how God had created us. Adam and Eve before the fall had no shame about their bodies. Depicting human beauty was recovering prolapsarian innocence, seeing humanity as God had intended before sin brought corruption. These ideas circulated in discussions in the Medici Palace, at the Platonic Academy, in workshops where artists debated technique and meaning. Florence in the late 1500s was a place where intellectual and artistic life interpenetrated completely, where you couldn't draw clear lines between philosophy and art because the same people were doing both, thinking through both, using each to illuminate the other. This integration of thought and making, of philosophy and practice, gave Renaissance art its particular depth. These weren't just beautiful objects. They were arguments, investigations, attempts to make visible what philosophy could only discuss in words. And in the hands of the greatest artists, Those attempts would succeed in ways that still move us centuries later. Step back from masterpieces and philosophy for a moment. What was it actually like to live in Florence during the Renaissance? What would you experience walking through the city on an ordinary day? Morning would begin with church bells, then their overlapping rhythms marking canonical hours across the city. Florence had dozens of churches, each with its bell tower, creating a constant auditory backdrop. The day started early. Workshops opened at dawn, taking advantage of natural light. Apprentices would already be up, preparing materials, sweeping, getting ready for the day's work. Bakers had been working since before dawn, filling streets with the smell of fresh bread. The streets themselves were narrow, buildings rising 3 or 4 stories, creating corridors of shadow. Unpaved in many areas, they would be muddy when it rained, dusty when dry. Open sewage channels ran along the sides. The city was working on improvements, paving more streets, better water and waste systems. But it remained a medieval city in many practical aspects. You'd see animals, horses certainly, but also pigs and chickens wandering in some neighbourhoods, part of the city's food supply. Markets would be active by mid-morning. The Mercato Vecchio sold food, vendors calling out their goods, haggling over prices. The Wool Guild's market dealt in cloth, showcasing Florence's primary industry. You'd see locals and foreigners hear multiple languages. Florence's trade network was international, and the city streets reflected that diversity. Merchants from across Europe conducted business there. Scholars from various countries came to study ancient texts. Artists arrived seeking training and patronage. Workshop doors stood open when weather permitted, allowing passers-by to glimpse work in progress. You might see a sculptor carving stone, chips flying with each chisel strike, or a painter's assistant grinding pigments, rhythmic work that filled hours, or apprentices stretching a canvas, preparing it for paint. The process of making art was public, visible, part of the city's daily life. Art wasn't hidden in studios. It happened in workshops that opened onto streets where everyone walked. Churches were always accessible, providing public space for prayer and also social gathering. You'd see people kneeling in private devotion, others meeting friends, some simply escaping the heat or cold. The interiors, especially newly decorated ones, dazzled with frescoes and altarpieces, free displays of the finest art for anyone who walked in. The church was democratic in this sense, making beauty available to everyone regardless of wealth or status. Afternoon would bring more business. Notaries' shops handled the constant flow of contracts and legal documents that commerce required. Money changers worked at their tables, exchanging currencies from different regions, calculating rates. Banking was becoming increasingly sophisticated, and Florence was at its centre. Loans were negotiated, debts settled, letters of credit issued for merchants travelling abroad. Public spaces like the Piazza della Signoria provided gathering places. Political debates happened there. Punishments were carried out there too, including executions, public reminders of justice and power. Tournaments and festivals used the piazza for celebrations. It was Florence's living room where the city came together to witness important events, to see and be seen. Evening brought a different atmosphere. As light faded, work stopped. Families gathered for meals. Those who could afford it enjoyed wine and conversation. The wealthy might host dinners where humanist learning and artistic matters were discussed alongside politics and business. For ordinary Florentines, evenings were simpler, time to rest from the day's labour, to attend to family matters, perhaps to visit a neighbourhood tavern for ale and news. At night, Florence became darker and more dangerous. Few streetlights existed. Those who needed to go out carried lanterns. The night watch patrolled, trying to maintain order, but the shadowed streets could harbour thieves and worse. Most people stayed home after dark, behind doors barred against the night. Throughout all this daily life, the products of the Renaissance were simply there, part of the environment. That church you passed had Botticelli frescoes. The cathedral's dome rose above the rooflines wherever you walked. Public fountains showed the sculptural skill Florence commanded. Living in Renaissance, Florence meant living immersed in beauty and craftsmanship, seeing daily evidence of what human skill could achieve. For the artists themselves, the city provided both inspiration and competition. Walking these streets, seeing others' work, knowing that your own work would be judged by demanding eyes, all this shaped ambition. You couldn't be mediocre in Florence, not if you wanted success. The city expected excellence and was willing to pay for it, but the bar was set high. This was the environment that produced the Renaissance, a city of wealth and talent and hunger for beauty, where daily life and high art interpenetrated, where you might commission a painting from a genius or watch one being made while walking to the market. It was specific to this place and time. This particular conjunction of factors that couldn't last forever. But while it lasted, Florence was the centre of the artistic world, the place where the future was being made. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452 in Vinci, a small town outside Florence, the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman. His irregular birth prevented him from following his father's profession or attending university, but it also freed him from certain expectations, allowed him to become something no legitimate nobleman would have considered, an artist and engineer whose curiosity recognized no boundaries. He came to Florence as a teenager, apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the city's leading artists. Verrocchio's workshop was perfect for Leonardo's expanding interests. Verrocchio worked in multiple media, sculpture and painting, metalwork and engineering. The workshop took on diverse projects, from altarpieces to bronze castings to designing fountains. Leonardo absorbed everything, learned every technique the workshop offered, and then began asking questions no one had quite asked before. Why does water flow the way it does? How do birds achieve flight? What makes some faces beautiful and others not? What happens inside the eye when we see? Leonardo filled notebooks with observations, sketches, questions, investigations. He dissected corpses, illegal but essential for understanding anatomy. He studied geometry and proportion. He experimented with engineering designs, imagining machines that wouldn't be built for centuries. His curiosity was omnivorous, indiscriminate, equally fascinated by the pattern of water flowing around an obstacle and the structure of a flower. In his 20s, while still in Florence, Leonardo contributed to Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, painting an angel that reportedly so outshone the master's work that Verrocchio gave up painting altogether. The story might be apocryphal, but the angel does show Leonardo's emerging genius, the soft modelling and naturalistic detail that would become his hallmark. He was developing a technique called sfumato, using subtle gradations of tone without clear outlines, creating forms that seem to emerge from shadow rather than being outlined against it. But Leonardo struggled to finish things. His mind moved too fast, saw too many possibilities, got distracted by new questions. He'd start a painting, become fascinated by some technical problem it raised, spend months investigating that problem, and never return to complete the painting. Patrons found this frustrating. They wanted finished works, not abandoned experiments. Leonardo wanted to understand everything, and finishing a single painting seemed trivial compared to understanding how light travelled or how the heart pumped blood. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence for Milan, seeking patronage from Ludovico Sforza. He would spend nearly 17 years there, working on engineering projects, designing festivals, painting a few works, and constantly observing and recording. The Milanese period produced The Last Supper, painted in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, one of the most famous images in Western art. Leonardo experimented with technique, trying a new approach to fresco that would ultimately fail, causing the painting to deteriorate rapidly. but the composition was revolutionary, showing the moment Christ announces that one disciple will betray him, capturing the reaction of each disciple in a psychologically complex narrative. Leonardo's investigations continued. He studied optics to understand how the eye perceives light and colour. He dissected human bodies to map every muscle and organ. He designed flying machines based on observing birds. He investigated urban planning, weapons design, hydraulic engineering, mathematics, astronomy. In his notebooks, art and science interpenetrated completely. A drawing of a baby in the womb might appear next to calculations about projectile motion. Anatomical studies shared pages with sketches for paintings. This was the Renaissance ideal of the universal man taken to its extreme. Leonardo didn't just practice multiple disciplines, he refused to acknowledge boundaries between them, everything connected. Understanding light helped you paint better. Understanding anatomy helped you design more accurate sculptures. Understanding engineering helped you conceive better compositions. Knowledge was unified, and the more you understood about anything, the better you understood everything. When Leonardo returned to Florence in 1503, he was famous but had completed relatively few works. The city he returned to was different from the one he'd left, more troubled, less confident. The Medici were gone, Savonarola had come and gone, political instability was constant. But Florence still had ambition, and still wanted the best artists. Leonardo would stay only a few years before moving on to Rome and eventually France, always seeking the next patron, the next opportunity to investigate some fascinating question. He left behind unfinished works, notebooks full of observations that wouldn't be fully appreciated for centuries, and a reputation as a genius too brilliant to be constrained by ordinary expectations of completion or consistency. Leonardo showed what human intellect could achieve when freed from conventional limits, when curiosity guided investigation rather than received wisdom or practical necessity. The Renaissance produced many great artists, but only one Leonardo. A mind so capacious it could barely be contained. Andrea del Verrocchio never achieved the fame of his students, but his workshop in 1470s, Florence was arguably the most important artistic training ground of the entire Renaissance. To understand the achievements of Leonardo, Botticelli, Perugino and others, we need to understand the environment Verrocchio created. Verrocchio was a complete artist in the 15th century sense. He worked in bronze, creating sculptures like his David and the equestrian monument to Bartolomeo Colleoni. He painted altarpieces and portraits. He designed and executed decorative metal work. He took on engineering projects. His workshop reflected this versatility, training apprentices in multiple media and techniques. This wasn't unusual for the period. Specialization would come later. But Verrocchio's workshop seemed to produce an unusually high proportion of exceptional artists. Part of this was Verrocchio's own skill and knowledge. He understood bronze casting at a technical level few could match. His sculptures show careful observation of anatomy and natural poses. He kept pace with innovations in painting, mastering perspective, and the new oil painting techniques arriving from Flanders. Apprentices in his workshop learned from a master who was genuinely excellent across multiple disciplines. But Verrocchio also seems to have encouraged independence and experimentation. He didn't insist that students replicate his style exactly. He gave them room to develop their own approaches, their own interests. When Leonardo showed exceptional talent and curiosity that went beyond traditional art training, Verrocchio supported it, allowed him to pursue investigations into engineering and science, even though they weren't directly relevant to painting or sculpture. This flexibility meant talented students could grow in their own directions rather than being forced into a single mould. The workshop took on diverse projects, which gave apprentices varied experience. They might work on a large bronze sculpture one month, a painted altarpiece the next, designs for a festival after that. This variety built versatile skills and prevented boredom. The bronze casting alone involved complex processes, lost wax techniques that required precision and careful planning. Apprentices learned metallurgy, mould making, finishing work that transformed rough castings into polished masterpieces. Verrocchio also encouraged study of ancient art. Florence had collections of classical sculptures and fragments, and Verrocchio's students would draw from these, absorbing Roman approaches to human form and drapery. But unlike some masters who treated classical art as models to copy slavishly, Verrocchio encouraged using them as foundations for original work. Learn from the ancients, but then surpass them. This attitude fostered ambition and innovation rather than mere imitation. The competitive atmosphere of Florence added pressure. Other workshops were producing excellent work. Clients could choose among multiple highly skilled masters. This kept everyone sharp, prevented complacency. Verrocchio's workshop needed to produce work that stood out, that justified premium prices. This pressure filtered down to apprentices, creating an environment where merely competent wasn't enough. You had to excel. The workshop also provided community. Apprentices formed friendships, learned from each other, created networks that would last throughout their careers. The collaborative nature of large projects meant learning to work as a team, to contribute your part to something bigger than individual achievement. Later, when these students established their own workshops, they'd often collaborate with former fellow apprentices, maintaining connections from their training days. Lorenzo de' Medici commissioned work from Verrocchio, giving the workshop access to the highest level of patronage. This meant exposure to the Medici circle, to humanist scholars and other artists, to the latest ideas circulating in Florence. Apprentices could overhear conversations about Platonic philosophy, or the newest ancient texts being translated. They absorbed intellectual culture alongside artistic technique, becoming educated in the broader sense that humanism valued. When Verrocchio died in 1488, his students had already surpassed him in fame. Leonardo was working in Milan. Botticelli had established his own successful practice. Perugino was becoming known as one of the finest painters in Italy. These men would become more famous than their master, but they'd absorbed lessons from Verrocchio's workshop that shaped their entire careers. The technical excellence, the versatility, the willingness to experiment, the confidence to compete with the best. Verrocchio's workshop demonstrates how genius is nurtured, not just born. Talent needs training, guidance, opportunity. It needs an environment that encourages excellence without crushing individuality. It needs exposure to the best work of the past and present. It needs competition and collaboration, pressure and support, technique and freedom. Verrocchio created that environment, and from it emerged some of the greatest artists in history. The teacher might be less famous than the students, but the students owed him more than they could repay. Michelangelo Buonarroti was born in 1475 in Caprese, where his father served as a magistrate. The family moved to Florence shortly after, and it was there that Michelangelo's destiny would be shaped. His family considered themselves minor nobility, fallen on hard times, and his father initially opposed his son becoming an artisan, seeing it as beneath their station. But Michelangelo's obsession with drawing couldn't be denied. At 13, he entered Domenico Ghirlandaio's workshop, one of Florence's busiest and most successful. Ghirlandaio was a skilled fresco painter, working on commissions for major churches. But after only a year, Michelangelo moved to the Medici Sculpture Garden, where Lorenzo the Magnificent had gathered ancient sculptures for study. This was unusual. Most apprentices spent years with a single master, learning their craft thoroughly before moving on. But Lorenzo recognized Michelangelo's exceptional talent and made special arrangements, eventually inviting the teenager to live in the Medici Palace itself. In the sculpture garden, Michelangelo absorbed lessons from ancient Roman art. He studied how classical sculptors had rendered anatomy, how they'd captured motion in stone, how they'd made marble suggest flesh. But he also learned from Bertoldo di Giovanni, Donatello's former student, who oversaw the garden and provided guidance and technique. The combination of ancient examples and living instruction gave Michelangelo a foundation no one else quite had. More importantly, living in the Medici palace exposed Michelangelo to humanist learning and Neoplatonic philosophy. He heard scholars like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola discuss Plato, debate the nature of beauty and the soul, argue about classical versus Christian thought. This intellectual immersion would profoundly shape Michelangelo's artistic vision. He came to see sculpture not as mere craft, but as philosophy made visible, the revelation of ideal forms trapped in matter. Even in his teenage works, Michelangelo's extraordinary talent was evident. The Madonna of the Stairs, a marble relief carved when he was about 16, shows a young Madonna with the Christ child, other children visible in the background. The carving technique, called rilievo schiacciato or flattened relief, creates the illusion of depth in very shallow carving. The figure of the Madonna shows sophisticated understanding of anatomy and drapery. It's a mature work created by an artist who barely qualified as an adult. The Battle of the Centaurs, carved shortly after, demonstrates even more ambition. It shows multiple struggling nude figures, a violent classical subject rendered with astonishing energy. Bodies twist and overlap, limbs tangle, the composition seethes with motion. For a teenager to attempt something this complex and succeed this well was remarkable. Michelangelo was announcing his ambition, declaring himself ready to tackle the most challenging subjects. When Lorenzo died in 1492, Michelangelo's position became precarious. Lorenzo's son Piero lacked his father's judgment and generosity. The young artist returned to his father's house, continued working, but the protected environment of the Medici palace was gone. When the Medici were expelled in 1494, Michelangelo fled Florence, fearing association with the fallen family might be dangerous. He went to Bologna, then to Rome, seeking commissions and opportunity. In Rome, he carved the Pietà, showing the dead Christ in his mother's arms. He was only 23 when he completed it, but the sculpture is so mature, so technically perfect, that many refuse to believe someone so young created it. The pyramidal composition, the contrast between Christ's limp body and Mary's stable form, the emotional restraint that makes the grief all the more powerful, the sheer technical brilliance of making marble look like fabric draped over flesh. All of it announced that a master had arrived. Michelangelo's approach to sculpture came from Neoplatonic philosophy. He believed the form existed already in the stone, and his job was to remove what didn't belong, freeing the figure trapped within. This meant he worked by subtraction rather than addition, carving away stone rather than building up form. It required absolute confidence. Once you removed stone, you couldn't replace it. Every cut had to move toward the hidden form without overshooting. Mistakes were permanent. This philosophy also meant Michelangelo saw himself not as creating, but as revealing. God had created the ideal forms. Michelangelo was just the instrument that made them visible. This didn't make his work less original. The vision of what form existed in the stone came from the artist's mind, his understanding of ideal beauty. But it connected his work to something larger than individual expression, to Platonic ideals and divine order. When Michelangelo returned to Florence in 1501, he was already famous. The Pietà had established his reputation. The city had a commission waiting for him, a massive block of marble that several sculptors had attempted and abandoned. It sat in the cathedral workshop, 17 feet of Carrara marble, partially carved, waiting for someone brave enough to tackle it. Michelangelo was 26 years old and ready to create the most famous sculpture in the world. In 1504, Florence staged what might be the most remarkable artistic competition in history. The city commissioned Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti to each paint a large battle scene in the Palazzo Vecchio's great council hall on opposite walls. The two greatest artistic geniuses of the age, working in the same space on comparable projects, invited inevitable comparison. The circumstances were unusual. Florence had recently become a republic again after years of Medici domination. The government wanted to celebrate Florentine military victories with grand public art. The council hall, where the republican government met, needed decoration that proclaimed civic pride and martial success. Commissioning both Leonardo and Michelangelo seemed like a brilliant idea, bringing the two most famous artists to create public masterpieces. Leonardo was to paint the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory from 1440. Michelangelo would paint the Battle of Cassina, depicting a Florentine engagement with Pisan forces. Both were given massive walls to cover, projects that would take years and consume enormous resources. Both began with preparatory drawings and cartoons, full-size drawings that would guide the actual painting. Leonardo's cartoon for Anghiari showed a violent cavalry clash, horses and men tangled in combat, the chaos and brutality of battle captured with terrifying energy. Witnesses who saw the cartoon described it as astonishing, showing Leonardo at the height of his powers. The twisting figures, the variety of expressions, the sense of violent motion frozen in an instant, all demonstrated Leonardo's unmatched ability to observe and depict complex action. Michelangelo's cartoon for Cassina took a different approach. It showed Florentine soldiers bathing in the Arno, suddenly called to arms by a false alarm. Rather than battle itself, Michelangelo depicted the moment before, men caught naked and vulnerable, scrambling for weapons and armour. This let him show what he did best, the male nude in complex poses, twisted and foreshortened, displaying every muscle and anatomical detail. It was less about the battle and more about demonstrating absolute mastery of human form. Both cartoons became instant sensations. Artists flocked to see them, to study them, to copy details that showed new possibilities in depicting human figure in action. Raphael, then a young artist working in Florence, studied both carefully, learning from each master. The cartoons themselves became educational tools, free lessons from the greatest artists of the age, visible evidence of what painting could achieve. But neither fresco was ever completed. Leonardo began painting his battle scene using an experimental technique, an encaustic method involving heated wax. It failed. The colours ran, the lower portions overheated while upper portions stayed too cool. Leonardo abandoned the project in frustration. Michelangelo was called to Rome by Pope Julius II before he could begin painting his wall. The cartoons remained, studied and copied for years until they deteriorated or were cut up for souvenirs. We know the designs now only through copies and descriptions. Rubens made a copy of Leonardo's central section, showing the furious cavalry battle. Various artists copied figures from Michelangelo's composition. But the completed frescoes that might have stood together in the council hall, that might have let viewers directly compare the two greatest geniuses, never existed. The competition revealed the contrast between them. Leonardo was all about observation, about capturing the natural world's complexity, about understanding how things actually work and appear. His battle showed research into how horses move, how armour catches light, how faces contort in rage and fear. Michelangelo was about the ideal, about showing not how bodies actually are, but how they should be according to classical principles. His soldiers were athletes, perfect specimens displaying anatomical knowledge that came from dissection and classical sculpture, not from observing actual Florentine soldiers. Leonardo was scientific, investigative, trying to understand principles underlying appearances. Michelangelo was philosophical, pursuing ideals, revealing forms that existed in the Platonic realm even if earthly reality provided only imperfect copies. Both were right. Both approaches produced masterpieces. The tragedy is that they never stood together, never allowed direct comparison. The rivalry was real, but perhaps overstated. They respected each other's abilities even while disagreeing about methods and priorities. Leonardo admired Michelangelo's sculptural power. Michelangelo respected Leonardo's inventiveness and knowledge. but they represented different visions of what art should be, different philosophies of representation and beauty. Their incomplete battle scenes became a legend, a story of what might have been, of two titans working simultaneously in the same space, each producing work that showed possibilities the other wasn't pursuing. Together, they might have demonstrated the full range of what Renaissance art could achieve. Instead, we have fragments, copies, descriptions. And the tantalizing thought of what those walls might have shown if both men had completed their visions. Girolamo Savonarola arrived in Florence in 1490 as a preacher with a message that challenged everything the Renaissance celebrated. Born in Ferrara, trained as a Dominican friar, Savonarola was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely convinced that Florence had strayed from God's path. His early sermons attracted little attention. But as political instability grew, and Lorenzo de' Medici's death in 1492 removed a stabilizing influence, Savonarola's apocalyptic warnings found an increasingly receptive audience. He preached against luxury and vanity. He condemned the Medici for their wealth and worldliness. He criticized the papacy for corruption. His vision of Christianity was austere, focused on sin and judgment, emphasizing repentance over celebration. The beautiful art, the classical learning, the humanist confidence in human dignity, all of it struck Savonarola as dangerous pride, distraction from salvation, perhaps even demonic temptation. Florence had become a new Babylon, he proclaimed, and God's judgment was coming unless the city repented. When the Medici were expelled in 1494, Savonarola emerged as Florence's spiritual and effectively political leader. He established what he called a Christian republic, a theocratic government guided by his interpretation of Scripture. Laws were passed against gambling, homosexuality, and various forms of entertainment. Bands of young men, organized by Savonarola, roamed the streets enforcing moral behavior, reporting violations, creating an atmosphere of surveillance and judgment. The culmination came with the Bonfire of the Vanities on February 7th, 1497. Savonarola organized a massive burning of objects deemed sinful or worldly. Books, paintings, sculptures, musical instruments, cosmetics, fine clothes, mirrors, anything associated with vanity or pagan learning was gathered in the Piazza della Signoria and burned. Florentines brought possessions voluntarily, caught up in Savonarola's vision of purification. Some brought items under pressure, fearing social or legal consequences if they didn't participate. The bonfire burned for hours, destroying countless works of art and learning, including some paintings by Botticelli, who'd fallen under Savonarola's influence. This wasn't just destruction of property. It was an attack on Renaissance values, a rejection of the synthesis Florence had achieved between classical learning and Christian faith, between celebration of human achievement and worship of God. Savonarola saw no middle ground. You couldn't serve both God and beauty. Classical learning was pagan error, not wisdom to be recovered. Human creativity, if it celebrated anything besides divine majesty, was pride. The entire Renaissance project, in Savonarola's view, was a wrong turn, leading Florence away from salvation toward damnation. But Savonarola overreached. He criticized Pope Alexander VI publicly, calling the papacy corrupt and the Pope an antichrist. He made political enemies who resented his power. His prophecies of divine intervention failed to materialize. Slowly, support eroded. The Arrabbiati, opponents of Savonarola's theocratic rule, gained strength. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tried for heresy and sedition, tortured until he confessed, and executed, burned at the stake in the same piazza where he'd burned vanities. His brief dominance left lasting marks. Some artists, like Botticelli, never fully recovered their earlier creative confidence. Many Florentines who'd supported him felt betrayed or confused when his promises proved empty. The Republican government he'd promoted would continue, but without his theocratic flavour. Most significantly, Savonarola had revealed how fragile the Renaissance consensus was, how many people felt troubled by the celebration of worldly things, how easily the synthesis could be rejected. But Florence didn't turn permanently from the Renaissance. After Savonarola's execution, artistic production resumed. The projects interrupted during his dominance restarted. New commissions emerged. Within a few years, Michelangelo was carving David, Leonardo was back in the city working on portraits and frescoes, Raphael was studying both masters. The Renaissance wasn't over. If anything, it was entering its highest phase, producing works that justified all the humanist confidence in human potential. Savonarola's moment passed, but it reminds us that cultural change always faces resistance, that for every person excited by new ideas there are others who see only danger, that progress, if we can call it that, isn't inevitable or unopposed. The Renaissance happened not because it was destined to, but because enough people in Florence chose beauty over austerity, chose learning over certainty, chose to celebrate human achievement while maintaining faith in divine purpose. That choice could have gone differently. For a few years it did, but in the end, Florence chose beauty, and the world was changed forever. After Savonarola's execution in 1498, Florence attempted to maintain its republican government. For 15 years, the city was without the Medici, governed by councils and elected officials, trying to embody the republican ideals that humanists had praised. But internal divisions, military pressures, and the fundamental difficulty of managing a small city-state in an age of emerging nation-states made the republic unstable. The Medici waited. Lorenzo's sons and relatives had fled when the family was expelled, but they maintained connections and resources. The family's banking network still existed, though diminished. They had allies in other Italian states and in the papacy. When Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, the family suddenly had immense power and resources. A Medici pope could pressure Florence diplomatically and militarily, could offer inducements and make threats that a republic couldn't easily resist. In 1512, Spanish troops restored the Medici to Florence. The republic fell with surprisingly little resistance. Tired of instability, worried about external threats, many Florentines accepted the return of the family that had dominated the city for so long. It wasn't a formal monarchy. The republican forms continued, the council still met, elections still occurred. But the Medici controlled everything that mattered, just as Cosimo had in the 1500s. The republic was dead in all but name. For artists, the change mattered less than you might think. The Medici had always been patrons. Their return meant patronage would flow to artists who could satisfy their tastes. Michelangelo, who had been protected by Lorenzo the Magnificent as a youth, found himself working for the family again, designing the facade for San Lorenzo Church, creating sculptures for Medici tombs. The projects continued, the masterpieces emerged, regardless of who held political power. But something had changed. The republican experiment, brief and troubled as it was, had represented possibility. Florence had tried to govern itself collectively, to embody humanist ideals about civic virtue and shared responsibility. The Medici return acknowledged that those ideals, however beautiful philosophically, couldn't sustain stable government in the real world of power politics. This was a kind of defeat, an admission that republics worked better in ancient Rome or classical Athens than in 16th century Italy. The Medici would continue as Florence's rulers, eventually becoming Grand Dukes of Tuscany, transforming from bankers who wielded influence into formal hereditary nobility. They would remain important patrons. The Medici chapels would house some of Michelangelo's greatest sculptures. Medici collections would preserve Renaissance art for future generations. But the family's relationship to Florence changed from patrons supporting a republican city's artistic achievements to rulers commissioning art that glorified their dynasty. This transformation from republic to principality reflected larger changes in Italy. The age of independent city-states was ending. Larger powers, France and Spain and the Habsburg Empire were dominating the peninsula. Small cities like Florence couldn't maintain independence against these forces. The political structures that had enabled the Renaissance, the republican governments and competing city-states and fragmented power, were giving way to larger, more centralized states. For the Renaissance itself, this didn't mean immediate end. Art and learning would continue, would spread across Europe, would influence culture for centuries. But the particular environment of Florence, the unique combination of factors that had made the city so creative, was changing. The workshop system would continue, but the sense of multiple centres competing and pushing each other to excellence was fading. Rome was becoming the dominant centre, drawing the best artists with papal commissions. Florence would remain important, but no longer central. The return of the Medici marks a transition, the end of one phase of the Renaissance and the beginning of another. The heroic age of innovation and discovery was passing into a period of consolidation and spreading influence. Florence had created something extraordinary, had shown what humans could achieve. Now that achievement would be absorbed, developed, and spread across Europe. The revolution had succeeded. Now came the challenge of sustaining and extending what had been gained. And though Florence's political independence was gone, its artistic legacy would prove impossible to contain. The innovations that emerged in Florence didn't stay confined to one city. Artists travelled. Techniques spread. Patrons elsewhere wanted what Florence had achieved. Gradually, the Renaissance transformed from a Florentine phenomenon into a European movement, adapting to different cultures while maintaining its essential character. Northern Italy provided the first expansion. Venice developed its own Renaissance. Influenced by Florence but distinctly different, Venetian painters like Giovanni Bellini and later Titian emphasized color over line, atmospheric effects over precise perspective, creating a sensuous style that contrasted with Florentine intellectual clarity. The Venetian Republic's trade connections to the East brought different influences, different materials, different subjects into their art. Rome, as the Medici gained papal power, became the new centre. Pope Julius II and his successors commissioned works on a scale Florence couldn't match. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael's Vatican frescoes, Bramante's plans for St. Peter's Basilica, all these projects drew the best artists to Rome and provided resources that exceeded anything available elsewhere. Rome's classical ruins also provided direct access to ancient models, allowing artists to study Roman architecture and sculpture firsthand. The North experienced its own Renaissance, though it developed somewhat differently. Netherlandish painters like Jan van Eyck had pioneered oil painting techniques earlier than Italy, developing an approach based on meticulous observation and layering of transparent glazes. When Italian Renaissance ideas about perspective and human form reached the North, they merged with this existing tradition, creating a hybrid style. Albrecht Dürer travelled to Italy, studied Italian techniques, and brought them back to Germany, creating works that combined northern detail with Italian understanding of proportion and space. France, under Francis I, actively recruited Italian artists. Leonardo spent his final years in France at Francis's invitation, bringing Renaissance ideals directly to the French court. French architecture began incorporating classical elements, symmetry and proportion, replacing Gothic vertical emphasis. The Château of Chambord, though still distinctly French, shows Renaissance influence in its regularity and classical detailing. Spain absorbed Renaissance ideas through its Italian possessions and through returning artists who'd trained in Italy. The Escorial, Philip II's massive palace monastery complex, combined Spanish severity with Renaissance regularity, creating a distinctly Spanish version of classical principles. El Greco, Greek-born but trained in Venice and Rome, brought an intensely personal interpretation of Renaissance techniques to Toledo. England came late to the Renaissance, maintaining Gothic traditions longer than the continent. But by the mid-1600s, English artists and architects were incorporating classical elements, and English poets were absorbing humanist learning and classical models. Shakespeare, though working a century after Florence's golden age, inherited a literary tradition shaped by Renaissance humanism's emphasis on human psychology and classical rhetorical techniques. The spread wasn't just about technique. Renaissance ideas about human dignity, about the value of classical learning, about the possibility of human achievement, travelled along with artistic methods. Universities across Europe began teaching humanities subjects modelled on Italian humanist curricula. The printing press, developed by Gutenberg in the mid-1500s, allowed rapid dissemination of texts that had previously circulated only in expensive manuscripts. Ancient authors became widely available. Contemporary thinkers could reach audiences across Europe. The Renaissance became truly European, transforming from a specifically Italian and particularly Florentine phenomenon into a broader cultural movement. But it lost something in the translation too. The synthesis that Florence achieved, where art and philosophy and civic life all reinforced each other, where wealthy patrons competed to support the best artists, where political instability somehow coexisted with extraordinary creativity, that particular constellation of factors couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Other cities had their own achievements, their own contributions, but they weren't Florence in its golden age. By the mid-1600s, the Renaissance was everywhere, and therefore not particularly distinctive anymore. Its innovations had been absorbed, become the new normal. Perspective was standard technique. Classical learning was expected. Humanism shaped educational practice. The revolution had succeeded so completely that it no longer seemed revolutionary. Later generations would look back at Florence and see something unrepeatable, a moment when everything came together, when human genius produced masterpieces that remained unsurpassed. The city itself would retain that aura, becoming a destination for anyone interested in art and history. The works remained, housed in churches and museums, permanent testimony to what humans had achieved there. The Renaissance spread because it deserved to, because it offered tools and ideas that people elsewhere found valuable. But it began in Florence, and in some essential way, it remained Florentine, carrying with it wherever it went something of that city's particular genius for transforming wealth and competition and talent into beauty that would last forever. Step back from individual works and artists to consider what Renaissance Florence gave the world, what enduring changes emerged from those 2 centuries of creative ferment. First, and most obviously, techniques. Perspective drawing transformed how we represent space, creating a system that remained standard 5 centuries later. Artists still learn to construct perspectives, still use vanishing points and horizon lines, still employ the method Brunelleschi discovered. The mathematics of perspective influenced architecture, engineering, stage design. Eventually photography and film. We see space differently because Florentine artists learned to depict it accurately. Anatomical knowledge advanced dramatically because artists dissected bodies, studied musculature and skeleton, learned how human form actually worked. This knowledge fed back into medicine, contributing to scientific understanding. The careful observation Renaissance artists practiced, the insistence on looking closely at the actual world rather than relying on received wisdom, helped create scientific method. Leonardo's notebooks show no distinction between artistic study and scientific investigation. Both required the same careful observation, the same willingness to question assumptions. Oil painting technique, refined in Italy from Netherlandish innovations, expanded what painting could achieve. The slow drying time allowed blending and reworking, creating subtle effects impossible in fresco or tempera. The depth of colour, the luminosity possible with transparent glazes, the ability to work in fine detail, all this made oil painting the dominant technique for centuries. Most paintings you see in museums, from the 1500s through the 1900s, use techniques Renaissance artists developed. But beyond technique, Florence gave us ways of thinking. Humanism's emphasis on human dignity and potential, its celebration of achievement, its confidence that humans could understand and improve their world, these ideas shaped modern Western culture profoundly. The notion that education should develop the whole person, not just train for specific roles, comes from Renaissance humanist ideals. Liberal arts curricula, emphasizing broad learning across humanities and sciences, reflect Renaissance educational philosophy. The Renaissance helped create the concept of the artist as individual genius, rather than anonymous craftsman. Medieval artists had often been anonymous, their works unsigned, their personalities lost. Renaissance artists signed their works, wrote about their methods, became famous as individuals. Michelangelo and Leonardo were celebrities, known across Europe. Their personalities and eccentricities part of their legend. This changed how we think about creativity, establishing the model of the artist as someone special, gifted, deserving recognition and study. Classical learning became a permanent part of Western education because Renaissance humanists recovered and promoted it. We study Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, and history because they brought these texts back and argued for their importance. The Western canon, the idea that certain ancient texts deserve preservation and study, took shape in Renaissance Florence. For better and worse, this shaped education and thought for centuries. The Renaissance also gave us museums, in a sense. The Medici collections and similar aristocratic collections established the practice of preserving and displaying art for education and pleasure. These eventually became public museums, making art accessible to everyone. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence, originally built to house Medici administrative offices and art collection, became one of the world's first public museums. The idea that cultural heritage should be preserved and made available to the public, not hoarded by the wealthy, emerged partly from Renaissance collecting practices. Architecturally, the Renaissance gave us the classical language of columns and pediments, proportions and symmetry that dominated Western building for centuries. From Thomas Jefferson's Monticello to the US Capitol to countless courthouses and banks and universities, the classical style Renaissance architects revived remains ubiquitous. Buildings communicate ideals of democracy, stability, rationality, partly through adopting forms that Renaissance Florence recovered from Rome and adapted to modern use. Perhaps most profoundly, Florence demonstrated that culture could be deliberately created, that human effort and resources could produce beauty and learning on a grand scale. This sounds obvious now. But the medieval world had generally accepted that culture emerged slowly from tradition, that rapid change was suspect, that the past was usually superior to the present. Florence showed that humans could innovate, could recover lost knowledge and surpass what had been achieved before, could consciously create a cultural revolution. This confidence in human agency, in our ability to shape our own cultural and intellectual environment, became fundamental to modern Western civilization. Not all these changes were unambiguously good. The focus on individual genius could obscure collaborative nature of artistic production. Classical learning's dominance sometimes excluded other traditions. The confidence in human reason could become arrogance, ignoring limits on human understanding. The celebration of elite culture could reinforce social hierarchies. But acknowledging complications doesn't negate the profound influence Florence exerted. We live in a world shaped by Renaissance Florence. When we visit museums, when we study humanities, when we value individual achievement, when we believe in human potential to understand and improve the world, we're inheriting ideas and practices that emerged or were refined in that small Italian city 600 years ago. The gifts remain, still shaping how we see ourselves and our possibilities. Modern Florence preserves its Renaissance past with unusual completeness. Walk the city today, and you're moving through spaces that would still be recognizable to Leonardo or Michelangelo, still marked by the achievements of their era. The Duomo still dominates the skyline, Brunelleschi's dome rising above the terracotta roofs, just as it did in the 1500s. Stand in the Piazza del Duomo and look up at that impossible structure, and you're seeing exactly what 15th century Florentines saw, feeling the same awe at engineering and ambition made visible. The lantern at the dome's peak catches morning light the same way it did 6 centuries ago. The cathedral's marble facade, though completed much later, maintains the medieval and Renaissance character. This space hasn't changed fundamentally. It still proclaims Florence's confidence and wealth, still demonstrates what human skill can achieve. Walk to Piazza della Signoria, and you're in Florence's civic heart, the space where the Republic met and conducted business, where Savonarola burned vanities and was himself executed. The Palazzo Vecchio still stands, its tower visible from across the city. The Loggia dei Lanzi holds sculptures, including Renaissance works, creating an open-air museum. A copy of Michelangelo's David stands where the original stood until it was moved indoors to protect it from weather and pollution. The Fountain of Neptune, created by Bartolomeo Ammanati in the 1560s, adds Baroque exuberance to the square's Renaissance austerity. Cross the Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge that survived World War II when other Florence bridges were destroyed. The bridge, lined with jewellery shops now instead of the butchers who occupied it in medieval times, provides the same views up and down the Arno that Renaissance Florentines enjoyed. The path leads to the Pitti Palace, built for a banking family that competed with the Medici, later purchased by the Medici themselves. The palace now houses museums and the Boboli Gardens, where visitors can walk among Renaissance sculptures and formal gardens, experiencing the kind of environment wealthy Florentines created for themselves. The churches preserve the Renaissance most completely. Santa Maria Novella contains Masaccio's Trinity, still creating its startling illusion of depth punched through the wall. Santa Maria del Carmine holds the Brancacci Chapel, where Masaccio's frescoes remain visible, teaching artists just as they did 600 years ago. San Lorenzo contains the Medici chapels, where Michelangelo's sculptures adorn tombs of Lorenzo the Magnificent and other family members, combining architectural design and sculptural power in spaces designed for contemplation and commemoration. The Uffizi Gallery, converted from Medici administrative offices into one of the world's great museums, displays Renaissance masterpieces collected over centuries. Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Primavera hang there, along with works by Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and countless others. You can spend days in the Uffizi and barely scratch the surface of its collection. Walking through its galleries is walking through the Renaissance itself, seeing the progression from early tentative innovations through confident mastery to Baroque elaboration. The Accademia Gallery houses Michelangelo's David, the most famous sculpture in the world. Seeing it in person is different from seeing reproductions. The scale surprises, over 17 feet tall, dominating the gallery designed specifically to showcase it. The detail visible in person, the veins in the hands, the focused expression, the slight turn of the head as David watches Goliath, all this creates an impression photographs can't capture. Other Michelangelo sculptures line the gallery, including his unfinished prisoners, figures struggling to emerge from stone, making visible the sculptor's philosophy about revealing forms trapped in matter. But beyond the famous sights, ordinary streets preserve Renaissance character. Buildings from the 15 and 1600s still stand, still serve as homes and businesses. Churches that commissioned Renaissance artists for their altarpieces still hold those works, still use them for their intended purposes of devotion and inspiration. The city's physical fabric maintains continuity with its Renaissance past in ways most cities don't. This preservation isn't accidental. Florence has consciously protected its heritage, limiting development that would destroy historic character, maintaining buildings and artworks, making its Renaissance legacy accessible to residents and visitors alike. The city understands that its past is its greatest treasure, that what happened here 6 centuries ago remains its most significant contribution to human culture. Walking Florence, you're walking through history, but history that remains present, that hasn't been relegated to museums and textbooks. The Renaissance here isn't dead past, but living presence, still shaping the city's identity, still visible in every piazza and church and palace. The echoes haven't faded. They're still here, waiting to be heard. And for anyone interested in what humans can achieve, in how beauty and thought and skill can combine to create something lasting, Florence remains essential pilgrimage. The city itself is the masterpiece, preserving and displaying its own creation. In the end, the Renaissance wasn't just about painting and sculpture, wasn't just about recovering ancient texts or building beautiful buildings. It was about changing how humans thought about themselves and their world, about demonstrating that human creativity and intelligence could achieve remarkable things, about suggesting that we might be more capable than we'd previously imagined. This happened quietly, without manifestos or declarations. It happened as people saw what Brunelleschi's dome achieved, recognized that moderns could do what ancients couldn't. It happened as they looked at Masaccio's frescoes and understood that painting could capture emotional truth, not just illustrate doctrine. It happened as they read Plato in the original Greek and discovered philosophical sophistication Christianity hadn't entirely supplanted. It happened as they watched Michelangelo carve David from abandoned marble and realized that human skill could create beauty that would endure for centuries. Each achievement suggested possibility. If Brunelleschi could engineer the impossible, what else might engineers accomplish? If Leonardo could investigate so many fields and advance them all, what did that say about human intellectual capacity? If Florence could transform from a medieval city into this centre of learning and beauty in just a few generations, what did that suggest about human agency, about our ability to shape our own culture and circumstances? The Renaissance didn't reject Christianity or faith. Most Renaissance figures were genuinely religious, saw their work as compatible with devotion, sometimes as an expression of it. Fra Angelico painted beauty to glorify God. Michelangelo believed he was revealing God's creative intention hidden in stone. Humanists like Ficino worked to reconcile Plato with Christian theology. The conflict wasn't between faith and reason, or between Christianity and humanism. It was about emphasis, about whether you focused primarily on human sinfulness and dependence on divine grace, or on human dignity and God-given capacity for achievement. Florence chose to emphasize the latter without rejecting the former. You could acknowledge human limitation while celebrating human potential. You could confess sins while taking pride in accomplishments. You could worship God while appreciating beauty in its earthly manifestations. This balance proved difficult to maintain. Savonarola represented one extreme, rejecting worldly achievement as pride. Later, excessive confidence in human reason would swing too far the other direction. But for a time, Florence found a middle path, celebrating human achievement within a framework of Christian faith. This changed politics too. If humans were capable and dignified, if we could govern ourselves through reason and virtue, then maybe republics could work. Maybe collective self-governance was viable. The Renaissance republics, including Florence, ultimately failed in the face of larger powers and internal divisions. But the idea persisted, influencing later political thought, contributing to ideas about democracy and human rights that would eventually transform governance across the Western world. The Renaissance also changed how we think about history itself. Medieval thought had seen history as decline from Eden toward judgment, with only Christ's sacrifice offering hope. Renaissance humanists saw history differently, as a story of human achievement with both highs and lows, with periods like classical antiquity representing heights that could be recovered and even surpassed. This created a different relationship to past and future. If ancients had achieved greatness, we could too. If their knowledge had been lost and recovered, we should preserve our own achievements carefully. History became something to learn from, not just a tale of sin and redemption. Perhaps most profoundly, the Renaissance established creativity itself as a value, making beautiful things, advancing knowledge, innovating and discovering. These became worthy goals in themselves, not just means to other ends. An artist wasn't just a craftsman fulfilling commissions. They were participating in something larger, using God-given talents to create beauty that would outlast their own life, contributing to human cultural heritage. This elevated the creative act, made it central to human dignity rather than marginal to it. We inherit all this, often without recognizing the source. When we value education, when we visit museums, when we celebrate creative achievement, when we believe humans can understand and improve the world, when we think governance should reflect consent rather than just divine right, we're drawing on ideas the Renaissance developed or refined. Not all these ideas were new. Some came from classical antiquity, rediscovered and adapted. Some emerged from Christian theology. But Florence synthesized them, demonstrated them, embodied them in works of art and thought that proved their validity. The revolution was quiet because it didn't overthrow governments or impose ideology through force. It happened in workshops and studios, in philosophical discussions and artistic experiments, in buildings rising and paintings emerging, in accumulated small decisions to value beauty and learning and human achievement. Each masterpiece was an argument, proof that humans could do this, that we had capacities worth celebrating. And cumulatively, those arguments changed the world, changed how we see ourselves, changed what we believe possible. Florence showed us ourselves differently, showed us more capable and dignified than medieval thought had suggested, showed us that heaven might be the ultimate goal, but earth deserved our best efforts too. That lesson, embodied in marble and paint and thought, remains Florence's greatest gift. We've travelled together now for the better part of 2.5 hours, moving slowly through Renaissance Florence, from Brunelleschi's dome rising against the Tuscan sky to Michelangelo's David, from Medici banking to Neoplatonic philosophy, from workshops where apprentices ground pigments to churches where frescoes still speak to us across 6 centuries. It's been a journey through beauty and thought, through human achievement and the questions it raises about what we are and what we might become. From Cosimo de' Medici's quiet patronage to Lorenzo the Magnificent's garden of genius, from Donatello making stone breathe to Botticelli painting pagan gods with Christian reverence, from Fra Angelico's heavenly blues to Leonardo's insatiable curiosity, from Masaccio's revolutionary frescoes to Michelangelo's Neoplatonic sculptures, we've seen what happened when wealth and talent and ambition concentrated in one small city over a few remarkable generations. We've witnessed how classical learning returned, how perspective changed painting, how philosophy and art enriched each other, how human dignity became a principle worth celebrating. The question at our beginning, whispered rather than shouted, was simple. What happened in Florence? What made this city at this time produce such an extraordinary flowering of human creativity? The answer, as honestly as I can give it, is that multiple factors converged. Wealth from banking and trade provided resources. Political structures gave merchants and artisans voice and influence. Ancient texts returned at the right moment to inspire new thinking. The workshop system trained talent rigorously, while encouraging innovation. Competition among patrons and among artists pushed quality ever higher. Humanist philosophy provided intellectual framework that valued beauty and learning. And perhaps most importantly, people chose to invest in culture, to spend their wealth and time creating things of lasting beauty rather than hoarding or consuming. No single cause explains it. But all these factors together, in that specific place and time, created an environment where genius could flourish, where innovation was celebrated, where the best work became the standard everyone tried to match or surpass. For 2 centuries, roughly from 1400 to 1600, Florence was the centre of the artistic world, producing masterpieces at a rate that seems impossible, training artists who would spread Renaissance ideals across Europe, demonstrating what humans could achieve when we combined skill and thought and ambition. If you enjoyed this slow drift through Renaissance Florence, a like and subscribe really helps others find these calm explorations of history and art. And please share your thoughts in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Have you visited Florence? Is there a particular artist or work from this period that speaks to you? I'd love to hear your reflections. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for making this community what it is, for your continued support of these journeys through history. Wherever you are in the world as you listen to this, I hope you're comfortable now. I hope your breathing has slowed and deepened. I hope the tensions of the day have released their grip on your shoulders and neck. I hope your thoughts have quieted, the constant noise of worry and planning giving way to something calmer. I hope your body feels heavy and warm, settled into wherever you're resting, ready to let go into sleep. Look up at the stars if you can see them from where you are. Those same stars shone on Florence 600 years ago, watched Brunelleschi building his impossible dome, illuminated Leonardo's notebooks as he worked late into the night sketching flying machines and mapping the human heart, cast shadows on marble as Michelangelo carved through candlelight. The stars haven't changed. We have partly because of what happened in that small Tuscan city, because of choices people made to value beauty and learning, to push boundaries, to believe humans could achieve remarkable things. Perhaps that's what matters most. The reminder that we're capable of more than we sometimes believe, that human creativity and intelligence can produce works that outlast empires, that beauty and thought can change how entire civilizations see themselves. Florence proved this, demonstrated it in ways that can't be denied because the evidence remains, visible in museums and churches, preserved for anyone willing to look closely and think carefully about what they're seeing. We carry that legacy, whether we acknowledge it or not, every time we value education, appreciate art, believe in human dignity, try to create something that will last beyond our own brief lives. We're drawing on wells Florence helped dig, following paths Florence helped clear. The Renaissance isn't dead past. It lives in how we think and what we value, in institutions we've built and ideas we've absorbed so completely we forget they had to be discovered and argued for. Sleep well tonight, knowing that across 6 centuries the beauty Florence created still speaks, still inspires, still demonstrates what humans at our best can achieve. Dream of marble coming to life under the sculptor's hand, of paint capturing light the way God created it, of domes rising against impossible odds, of minds expanding to encompass everything from anatomy to philosophy to engineering. Dream of Florence in its golden age, a city where talent and wealth and ambition combined to create wonders that would echo through time, and know that the same creative capacity those Renaissance masters embodied lives in us too, waiting to be recognized and developed, waiting for the right combination of opportunity and effort and courage to manifest. We're their heirs, inheritors of techniques and ideas and confidence they built, responsible for carrying forward what they began. Rest now. Let Renaissance Florence fade into the peaceful darkness where all great stories eventually come to rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. Let sleep come gently and completely. There's nothing more you need to do tonight. Just rest and let the journey we've shared together settle into memory, into dreams, into whatever quiet places the mind goes when it finally gratefully lets go. Good night.